It is blitz. It is freezing out here. Pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Now, a couple of months ago, I decided to visit some museums in central London. When I approached the British Museum, the security guard said to me, "Sorry, sir, you cannot get in unless you book online or if you have downloaded a COVID app to your phone. Then they can look at your barcode and let you in." That is when I realized, yes, we are definitely in the new normal, the Great Reset. This study will be divided into two parts. The first part, we're looking at the new heaven and the new earth, the effects of the lockdown and the creation and the fall. And the second part, we're looking how to study the book of Revelation. And as I encourage you at all times, please research everything you have seen in this study.
For since the beginning of the world, men have not heard nor perceived by the ear, neither have the eye seen, O God, beside thee, what he has prepared for him that waiteth for him. God is preparing a new heaven and a new earth for those who want to be with him for eternity. It is a free invitation, and it is down to each individual to decide their eternal destiny. It is very difficult, or you could say practically impossible, for our finite minds to even imagine living in a complete new environment where there is peace and harmony in all the surrounding space. Imagine drinking pure, uncontaminated, crystal clear water that proceeds directly from God's throne. A world with no rainbows to remind us about a global flood. Imagine living in a brand new world where there is no night at all. Strange, isn't it? It is a promise that just does not fit into our reality, even though we are told that our mortal bodies will be transformed to immortality. Some scientists say that the planet Jupiter's gravity protects us against comets and asteroids. But in the new Earth, it is very highly unlikely that we would be invaded by a cluster of asteroids. There probably would be no meteorite showers, not in a newly designed terrain. Imagine living in a world with no fears of a hurricane, typhoons, storms, or floods. We don't need to worry about that, for we are told that there will be no more huge oceans to divide us. There will be no more sea. How can you as an individual prepare for something that you cannot see, taste, smell, or touch, and try to prepare others for that future promise also? A world where there will be no more cold, no snow, no huge ice glaciers, and probably no more rocky mountains and huge canyons carved out from water erosion. The geographical dynamics of the new Earth will definitely look very different to our current Earth we now live in today. It is very difficult for us to imagine the bird of prey, the eagle, the creature with one of the strongest eyesight in the animal kingdom, with its razor-sharp talons, will no longer use it for hunting its different species of prey, either in the air, on the land, or in the water. Tigers are the largest of the cats in the animal kingdom. Its teeth are 3 inches long, but in the earth made new, they will not be cutting flesh. They will be herbivores all over again. Imagine living in a world where antelopes will no longer have to be on their guard and on the lookout for fear of becoming an afternoon meal for a family of wild, carnivorous lions. For in the earth made new, all creatures will live in perfect harmony with each other like they once did in the beginning. Imagine living in a world with creatures that are the length of a bus. It may be surprising, but men once did, but they are now extinct. Cryptozoologists unearthed a huge crocodile in the Sahara Desert in Tunisia in North Africa. It was over 30 feet long, and its head alone was 5 feet in length. And yes, it was the length of a bus, as the modern scientific journals have confirmed. When you compare this marine-dwelling crocodile skull with a modern croc, it is clear that over thousands of years, this creature has amazingly shrunk. It is very hard to believe that these now carnivorous creatures were once herbivores roaming this earth. But when their earliest fossilized teeth were studied in a lab with close observation, they have recently discovered that the earliest crocs and alligators were originally herbivores. Yes, they had a complete strict diet of plants. This may be shocking to many, but if you just humbly read Genesis chapter 1 and verse 30, the first book in the Holy Scriptures, scientists are only confirming what God already said took place in the beginning of time in the earth. And in the earth made new, the crocs, and alligators will also live in perfect harmony with the rest of the animal kingdom. The baby turtle will no longer have to run for its life for fear of predators, and the turtle will feed on its original plant-based diet of the aquatic plant algae, and it will freely swim in the depth of the open waters, maybe or probably alongside man, and God will also restore it to what it once was. It was almost 100 times the size of its closest relative in the South American Amazon jungle. It was once about the size and length of a sedan automobile, and this car-sized reptile, titled Jupendimus geographicus, grew up to 13 feet, that is 4 meters long, and was 1.25 tons in weight. The paleontologist on the right, Rodolfo Sanchez, lies alongside this huge, unearthed fossilized turtle shell discovered in Venezuela, but it wasn't the only extinct giant in the Amazon jungle. The vertebrae on the left is of a modern python, and the huge one on the right, discovered in Colombia, is of its older, now extinct relative that scientists have titled Titanoboa, a snake that could grow up to 12.8 meters, that is 42 feet in length. That is huge. If snakes today are frightening to both man and beast, can you imagine seeing a creature of that size in the jungle? But in the earth made new, not only will there be no fear of a snake, its venomous bite, or being a meal on its daily menu, it will probably be restored back to how it was originally, before it was cursed and had to crawl on its belly. It could probably fly, and it probably had legs to walk with also. And this will take place in the animal kingdom in the new earth. But imagine living in a world where there be no use for doctors and nurses, no abnormalities or dysfunctional parts of our body, no emergency rooms for patients, where people would not have to make any efforts on making a single face mask for the citizens of the world. Even though many wear masks in the public anyway, pretending to be someone who they are not. In the new earth, we do not have to worry about a face mask. There will be no more viruses, for the atmosphere will be pure. Imagine living in a world with no fear, where young children can run freely and will not have to worry about being violated or need any counseling to protect them from ongoing, unresolved childhood issues later on in life. It will be a world where man will not be hunting innocent animals for sport, game, or for food, for man's diet will be completely meat-free. No fear of it going stale with maggots. No food will be killed and chopped up by man's consumptions, and he will be going back to his pure, original, natural plant-based diet of the herb-bearing seed. Man will once again have access to what was taken away from him for his disobedience, the tree of life, which is for the healing of the nations. But why do the nations need healing? As scientists take a very close observation of man by studying every detail of his body, they are realizing that modern man is definitely not evolving, but he is actually shrinking. And like the different species in the animal kingdom over thousands of years, he's getting smaller, and his brain is also becoming a lot more reduced in size. As anthropologists unearth the earliest skulls in Ethiopia, they have discovered that they are much bigger than their current descendants, and the skulls of early Europeans were also far bigger than their current descendants, and in Siberia they have found giant human teeth. It is also a clear testament that man has shrunk. But there is a current issue that will definitely not exist in the new heaven and in the new earth: the issue of racism. You see, God is a brilliant artist. He created man with distinct features. We will never know what the first man looked like. Our only clue is that Adam was red or ruddy. But we, his descendants scattered all over the world, all come in different shades and have different facial features. Some of our hair texture is different, and some of our skin texture varies according to the climatic regions we dwell in. When you carefully look at the skin tone of these women from the continents of Afro-Eurasia, they may slightly differ in certain features, but they are all just different shades of brown, but they have the same red blood. When early man migrated from the Arak Mountains in Asia Minor to repopulate the earth, it may have been the climatic conditions that changed and molded his distinct features. This young woman from the Orient in the Middle East still has the distinct olive brown skin, dark hair and facial features as her ancient forebears. And some of the earliest artwork from that era carved by very skilled metallurgists, shows the clear and distinct features of the descendants of Shem. This young man of European descent still has the distinct facial features of his early forebears in the Northern Hemisphere. And in the earliest cave art in France, this woman's head, carved from mammoth ivory, one of the earliest known realistic representations of a human face, shows the clear and distinct features of the descendants of Japheth. People from the African continent have been labelled by Europeans as black, but they're not black, they're just a very darker shade of brown than others, and they also still retain those distinct African Cushite features that are passed on down to their descendants unabated. Most of North Africa was once a lush green oasis before it became a vast desert that the Arabs called the Sahara. Before Africa had a much later influx of lighter-skinned people, the whole of North Africa, that is Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya and Egypt, was once originally peopled by black Africans before it became a vast desert, and where most eventually left. The earliest cave art is a living witness and testimony to that, where the distinct black African features are still preserved in stone, and the descendants of Ham also have their distinct features that have stood the stress of time for thousands of years. Blacks come in a variety of shades, from the very dark tribes of the Sudan to the lighter San people of South Africa. Their curly hair has the slowest growth than any other people on earth. They have the strongest bones, very full lips, and their skin is a lot slower to wrinkle and age than others. While many blacks think some of these features, such as their wide nose, is a distinct feature of theirs only, it can also be found in other parts of the world. The Aborigines of Australia and men in India also have wide noses. And even when you go throughout the continent of Southeast Asia, they also have very wide noses, especially in Cambodia, where you see many of its citizens with very flat noses. That is a distinct feature that is also preserved in the rock art of their forebears in the Cambodian jungle. Others share similar features. In the continent of Europe, the inhabitants have the widest variety of eye color and hair color than anywhere else in the world. Some have blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, hazel eyes, etc. Some have jet black hair, ginger or auburn hair, or very light brown hair, and as you go further north, they have a very lighter, paler skin complexion, and a more darker, duskier complexion as you go further south. This woman is just a light shade of brown, and behind her is the color white. The term white people was coined by English colonists in North America in the 1600s, and it was not until the early 20th century that both the Irish and Italian immigrants, who both were originally viewed as outcasts, were officially allowed to be categorized as white people on the US consensus. Many Europeans believe that their light brown hair that has been termed as blonde singles them out as a distinct people from the rest of the world. Adolf Hitler used it as a badge of Aryan superiority. But when you travel to the Micronesian islands in the Pacific, you see some of the darkest people outside of the African continent, and guess what? They also have blonde hair. It is a very interesting sight to see, and DNA tests have shown that it is distinctly their own. They vary in their appearance. Some look like they are directly from the African continent, and others look like a mix of Afro-Eurasian. And their hair texture varies from being very straight like Eurasians to very curly like the people of the African continent. So as much as mankind may think within his group that he's better than all the others, they are all just different shades of brown with some striking similarities in each of them. And once he realizes that, ethnic differences become completely irrelevant. You see, race was not an issue back in the ancient world, as you can see from this artifact from ancient Greece in the British Museum. They were intrigued with each other's differences. But in the modern world, man has viciously turned against each other. Do you want to know why? One of the reasons? Because of their distinct features. And as mankind becomes more and more degenerate, savage, inhumane, and cruel to each other, in the 21st century, even during a global lockdown, men all over the world do not even give the planet a single day of rest or peace, for he continues to debate, fight, and he even kills each other over a different ideology, over ethnic differences, land expansion, and they bully the vulnerable over their energy-rich natural resources.
Anger at racial discrimination and police brutality continues to simmer across the United States.
Death to America, death to Israel and the West, they're chanting.
Mali and Niger have been in the grips of escalating violence since 2012.
A decades-old conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia reignited.
Tensions mounting in the Mediterranean Sea. Turkey and Greece are just another provocation away from engaging in an all-out armed conflict.
Mexico is on pace for another year of record violence. In the first 6 months of 2020, there were 17,439 murders.
West Papuan activists are fighting for independence from Indonesia like never before.
During the second half of this study, when we will be going into the book of Revelation, we will show that all of these troubled and broken nations around the world have to hear the everlasting gospel. But what many of us see taking place all around us, all over the world, and sadly the things most don't see, is the exact detailed description of how Jesus Christ prophetically described the last generation on this earth, and their spiritual condition, and their immoral state and decline, just prior to his glorious second coming. If you're not clued up with the right material, a system can sadly, without you being aware of it, destroy and crush your dreams of your family planning, not through negligence, but by outright deliberate wickedness of a well-orchestrated and monopolized system that continues to practice subtle infanticide with very few people in the know of what is going on. These are the sad lengths fallen man will stoop to. Man will constantly clash in these end times with each other, exploiting the vulnerable where he wants to dominate the weak for his own greedy economic interests, not caring one bit of neither age or gender or who gets hurt, for he is deeply selfish, and corporate interests and their desire for increased profits is ruining many people's lives. But before we get into the meat of prophecy, before we go into a very deep historical and exegetical study and the depth of how to prepare for the new heaven and the new earth, the narrator has to briefly show one of the major obstacles that we will face before you make it into eternity, and we will go into more thorough detail near the end and look at the root cause of the background of the conflict that is currently taking place here on this earth.
There may and likely will come a time in which we have both an airborne disease that is deadly. And in order for us to deal with that effectively, we have to put in place an infrastructure, not just here at home, but globally, that allows us to see it quickly, isolate it quickly, respond to it quickly.
Classrooms have robots that analyze students' health and engagement levels. Students wear uniforms with chips that track their locations. There are even surveillance cameras that monitor how often students check their phones or yawn during classes. These gadgets have alarmed Chinese netizens.
Now for more on Israel's decision to allow the security agency Shin Bet to track the movements of people with the virus.
Something as simple as wearing a watch that may soon be able to tell you if you have the flu or COVID-19.
As companies prepare for employees to return to the workplace, businesses are considering different ways of monitoring employees for possible COVID-19 infections. And a new survey by Gartner, that's an IT service management company, found more than half of the employers in the country are making plans to collect temperature data on employees.
In the small town of Westport, Connecticut, a drone is scanning for COVID-19 symptoms.
Vladimir Bykovsky was put under a 2-week quarantine after returning from South Korea.
Камеры установлены на каждом подъезде. Я, честно говоря, думал, что они относятся к системам видеодомофонов для жителей, но оказалось, что они подключены в систему слежения, которая во всей Москве работает.
Считаю, что массовое использование технологий распознавания лиц на городских камерах – это тотальная слежка государства за гражданами, и государство это 100% будет использовать только в своих интересах против политических оппонентов или против людей, которые власти не нравятся.
Remember the 5th of November.
Those caught in violation of curfew will be prosecuted without leniency or exception.
It's past curfew, you know.
The 8 o'clock curfew, the earliest in South Florida.
20 million French people must be back at home as a new curfew takes effect this weekend.
Sirens blare across the Jordanian capital, warning residents to stay in their homes.
Australia's Victoria has imposed a nightly curfew for the capital, Melbourne.
But the nationwide curfew enforced throughout the territory of the Republic of Kenya is extended for a further 60 days.
This morning, cash in the age of COVID-19. The pandemic appears to be accelerating the rise of digital currency. Here in the U.S., mobile payments have spiked dramatically since the outbreak. In the U.K., the BBC reports ATM withdrawals are down 60%. China's central bank has reportedly been disinfecting banknotes, while many businesses around the world are asking customers not to use cash at all. It's all making some wonder if the digital dollar is the new king of currency.
In the UK, the front page of the October 20th, 2020 Metro newspaper headlined on the left that the death toll soars in the UK, but not from COVID-19. RT News on October 19th, 2020 said more people die at home from cancer, heart disease and dementia in the UK since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the Office for National Statistics, the UK's largest independent producer of official statistics, in July 2020, the second bullet point reads that COVID was the 8th leading cause of death in England and did not even feature in the top 10 leading causes of deaths in Wales. COVID-19 was the 24th most common cause of death in England in August 2020, according to an 18th of September 2020 article in the British Daily Mail newspaper. So why are we in a lockdown if the British government's own official data is clear that COVID is extremely low on the radar for mortality deaths? The world's current population is roughly 7.7 billion and counting. And when leading analysts were monitoring the spread of the virus, they discovered that more than 6 months into the pandemic, the coronavirus has infected more than 11 million people worldwide, out of a population of 7.7 billion. The World Health Organization held a 2-day online meeting of 1,300 scientists from around the world. The agency's chief scientist, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, said the consensus for now was that the IFR, that is the infection fatality ratio, which estimates this proportion of deaths among all infected individuals, is about 0.6%, which means that the risk of death is less than 1%. And highlighted in red, the virus may be less deadly than it has appeared, according to the New York Times, July 4th, 2020. So the low mortality rate virus is being cleverly used for a much wider, very well calculated and orchestrated global program. And what have been some of the very destructive effects of the COVID lockdown around the world?
Some cities in China are reportedly seeing a spike in divorce filings after months of quarantine.
Family lawyers and couples counsellors
have reported a huge spike in Victorians separating or seeking a divorce.
Another side effect of COVID-19 on families, all this time together has pushed some marriages over the edge. It's something divorce attorneys have warned about since the shutdowns began.
Modern history has always shown that a recession will always lead to a very high increase in divorces. But very few people are aware of the deep psychological damage and scars it causes on innocent children. When their homes are broken, it destabilizes them and they are greatly affected, and that security they once had is gone. The COVID-19 lockdown has also led to a huge downplayed increase in global depression and suicides of people who are in deep despair. It is not normal for human beings to live in total isolation from one another. We need family and friends. Studies in the UK, though not highly publicised, has shown that there has been an increase in child suicide. They have never lived in a world like this. Similar results are in Japan, with both women and children, a country that already has a recent increase of suicides, and in China, mental health problems have grown by 35%, and suicide attempts have sadly doubled. There's also, sadly, been an increase in domestic violence, where cowardly men are battering their so-called loved ones to a pulp. Men who fail to deal with their own internalized issues. It's sick, and children are once again the ones who are neglected when an individual is battering their spouse senselessly. Most of us are totally unaware what happens behind closed doors. The narrator would like to ask a few very serious personal questions. Did you ever think that you would live in a world where virtually every ethnic group would be barely identifiable or unrecognizable because of some kind of face covering? The narrator still thinks that people just look very strange and odd. This is his own personal opinion. Did you think that you'll be robbed of your gym time where you can de-stress because of a virus that kills 1% of the world's population? Did you ever think that your own house of worship, your church, would be off limits to you, besides when it is going through a refurbishment? Did you ever think that you would walk past small businesses in your own area and they would be permanently closed? Did you ever think that you would be forced to isolate from loved ones and your only form of communication with family or friends would be in a digital chat room, or getting advice from the doctor was no longer private and personal, but now it is in a virtual space? Crazy. While people are suffering all over the world, being driven into extreme poverty, and even being denied foreign aid by the US-controlled monetary aid system, the Billionaires Club have profited handsomely from the virus, increasing their gazillions. And they have also developed new contracts to make weapons with the government. But there are also more darker things on the horizon. In the UK, many have watched films about British intelligence, both MI5 and MI6. But now some realities are now coming closer to home. Britain's MI5 can now legally murder, kidnap and torture anyone they suspect of being a domestic terrorist. A preparation of things to come. Many have voiced their concern, but it has fallen on deaf ears, and they have officially passed the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Criminal Conduct Bill in October 2020 that gives these agencies the power to reintroduce the Inquisition. The British Army have also been given the powers to assist in door-to-door coronavirus testing at a time when its government admits that it double-counted its own coronavirus tests. And the army has also been given new drones that can fly at 50 miles per hour and can also blow open doors with explosives. I hope you are paying attention, not just if you live in the UK, but anywhere, for things are slowly being put into place for a global takeover. But what has led to this state of the earth? What is really going on? What has man from time immemorial, beginning in the days of Nimrod up to this very day, have this deep dark obsession with rebelling and in controlling his fellow man? What has led to this? people all over the world are looking for deep answers and are unclear of what is going on. Where can this global madness be traced to? Let us take a time machine and go right back to the beginning of time, and we will get the right answers we are looking for. When God created the heaven and the earth in 6 days, neatly fitting in every planet, star, atom, water and air molecule and plant fibers in their rightful place, the crowning act of his creation was man. Man meaning both male and female, and he instructed them both to be fruitful, multiply and to replenish the earth, and they did as God instructed. Everywhere his naked eye could see was man's classroom, where he was to study the whole volume of the laws of nature. Every hectare of land and every unique species of plant was there for him to learn and to study from about the deep secrets of God's handiwork in creation. Before there was rain, God caused a deep mist to come up from the earth, and those carefully designed colorless and odorless molecules, the H2O oxygen and hydrogen atoms, watered the whole face of the ground, feeding that newly formed vegetation. And God gave man complete dominion and authority over every living species that moved, and he specifically gave to Adam the authority to name every single one of them, where he would form some kind of bond and relationship with each species. There was a unique attribute about each creature that Adam saw that he gave it that specific name, from studying their different sounds, colors, shapes, their smell and their different abilities to either fly, glide, swim, crawl or walk. Each one of them had the name of God engraved on it, and though the antennae of an insect looked strikingly similar to the horns of an antelope, Adam still named them differently. God also instructed each one of these creatures as he instructed man, whether they be a mammal, a bird, a reptile, an insect or an aquatic creature, to procreate, and through a divine act they did exactly what God instructed them to do. No two different species intermingled, for that would disrupt their own unique DNA gene pool and cause mass confusion. All of the creatures were originally herbivores, where every green herb that grew was its meat that nourished its body as it traveled through its complex, newly created digestive system, and that was all under the instruction of God's voice. And like the command of procreation, they all obeyed, and the whole of nature was then in perfect harmony with each other, with a perfectly functioning ecosystem. But then something happened that changed everything. An eeriness filled the air and nature started to change, and it was because a simple instruction was disobeyed, and man forfeited his dominion over the earth, and he now fears the creatures he once ruled. And as we are shown earlier, its repercussions are with us to this day when we see how man treats each other. Different species had to always be on the lookout to protect themselves and their families, and animals that once roamed carefree in the open plains with no qualms now lived in constant fear and had to be on constant guard. A new universal law of the survival of the fittest now began to dominate nature, and even the most boldest and swiftest of the hunters had to also be on their guard for fear of also not being the hunted. Creatures that were once friend turned into a foe, and different species would viciously turn on each other, not only to eat and to survive, but to guard their cherished territory, and the earth was to be dominated with one of the most mysterious events in this temporal mortal life that we still cannot understand and get our head around, but we all know we have to come to terms with it and face it one day. It is death. When that last heartbeat stops and we gasp our final breath, our loved ones cannot handle the grief of a loss, for it is horrible. The shock triggers an unexplained reaction in you. You can be laughing with them one day, then the next day they are gone forever. And deep down you so earnestly crave for them to come back. Today he is more boldly challenging what God instituted at creation. And in the ancient world, and still existed in small parts of the modern world, the reptile that was used as a medium replaced the true worship of the Almighty God all over the world, a sad statement from mankind to the Creator of who they saw as their true God, the creature, not the Creator. It has not really stopped. In a series of short films, God is presented as a very disgusting, foul-mouthed tyrant who deliberately causes misery on mankind and mercilessly kills and causes global misery and tragedies and wipes out whole communities for the fun of it. God's character is really on trial, but it has been an ongoing struggle. When the Apostle Paul went to Mars Hill in Athens, Greece in southern Europe to share the principles of eternity, he was challenged by the Greek school of thought, Epicurus, who founded the school of the Epicureans on the left, and Zeno, who founded the school of the Stoics on the right. And though Paul won a few converts, most were adamant that they did not want nothing to do with God. When Moses was in Egypt in North Africa, there was a similar scenario. The head of state, who was titled Pharaoh, made it pretty clear that he did not want to recognize God's authority, for he believed the lie at Eden that he was a god, and he wore the insignia of his god on his crown, the species of serpent called the cobra. And in Babylon in Western Asia in the Near East, the exact scenario took place many centuries later, when the Chaldean monarch King Nebuchadnezzar II was also at first very resistant to recognize God's authority over his life. But in every single age, God always has faithful men and women who sincerely seek him. And in the Middle East, two men were to briefly meet in a valley and were to both play a central role in the plan of salvation. One was the link through which Jesus was to draw all the nations back to God at Calvary, and the other was to be an earthly model of Christ's unchangeable intercessory role as our high priest in the temple in heaven, to also draw fallen man back to the true worship of God. In Genesis chapter 14 verses 18 to 21, we are introduced to an individual called Melchizedek, a king and a priest of the Most High God, who preserved the ancient and original worship of the one true God, and the patriarch Abraham, who at that time on his nomadic journey was then called Abraham, who also preserved that old ancient faith, and he was blessed by Melchizedek. The prophet, king and patriarch, the son of Jesse, David, under inspiration, prophesied in Psalms 110 Melchizedek's role in the plan of salvation. And in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 20, we get clarity that the psalm was describing Christ's intercessory role as our high priest before he returns to become king. That was modeled after the order of that king and priest, Melchizedek. In Genesis chapter 18 and verse 18, God prophesied that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed by Abraham. And in Galatians chapter 3 verses 28 and 29, we are told that that prophecy was fulfilled with the coming of Jesus Christ and his role in the plan of redemption. In Genesis chapter 11 and verse 31, we are told that Abraham left a city in the Middle East called Ur of the Chaldees. And today, respected scholars in the modern secular world are confirming that it was once one of the most prosperous cities in the ancient world.
When we look at Asia's ancient history, we see that exchange and mutual learning helped create a number of diverse and vibrant civilizations. "6,000 years ago, a bright blue gemstone became so popular across Mesopotamia that it was more highly prized than gold. Ur, built by the Sumerians, is one of the oldest cities ever discovered. Among the artifacts excavated here, the lapis lazuli ornaments are particularly striking.
The world has now recognized that Ur of the Chaldees, one of the oldest cities in the ancient world, geographically located in the Middle East, is also one of the first major cities that is mentioned in the Holy Scriptures. Today's generation, with sadly no scientific evidence at all to support their claims, is taught that man is evolving. But when the New York Times at the time of the archaeological excavation recorded the history of Ur, it said that the further they go back, the higher the civilization was that counters the theory of evolution. Ur, like the Indus Valley of Pakistan, India, the Olmecs of Mexico, and the Minoan civilization of the Greek island of ancient Crete, had a well-established drainage system. And as shown in the study titled Ur of the Chaldees by Even at the Doors, they had the oldest preserved law code known to man titled the Law of Ur-Nammu, and they also had the oldest preserved harp. Ur also had board games, different coloured pottery, and they could intricately carve into different metals like gold, silver, or copper. They could closely look at an animal like a goat and its facial and body features and neatly carve it and shape it from different materials into a still well-preserved artifact. They also preserved their distinct Near Eastern features as a descendant of Shem in their artwork, whether it be a man or a deity. And they also had a government with both a king and a prime minister as seen on this seal. Abraham must have left Ur with a number of different trades, for on the famous raw standard of Ur in the British Museum, you see on one side one of the oldest image of a military with their chariots and their soldiers, a military art that was adopted by Abraham, and on the other side in the middle section you see an image of men escorting cows and goats. With God's guidance, Abraham became an independent, self-made farmer, and he had a number of animals he acquired and cared for to keep and to sustain his livelihood and run his debt-free economy. He had a high number of camels, sheep, oxen, and asses, according to Genesis chapter 12 and verse 16 and chapter 24 and verse 35. And he migrated from the rich city of Ur and temporarily stayed in Egypt, where, while in that country, he also acquired a lot of wealth that included silver and gold. So he did not migrate into poverty, but into wealth. And being on his own land, he did not pay a mortgage, water rates, direct debit, council tax, land tax, corporation tax, value-added tax, personal income tax, inheritance tax, poll tax, national insurance tax, or capital gains tax. Oh, Father Abraham, we envy thee. He lived off the grid. The precious metals, the 19th century English Assyriologist Sir Austin Henry Layard said, were known at a very early period, even Abraham, a dweller in tents, being rich in gold and silver, as recorded in Genesis chapter 13 and verse 2. Today, when both men and women have lived their long life and feel they have worked for their living, they would retire at a certain age and live off their pension. Some men want to die at 75, and studies have shown that it is 75 when old age starts. But according to Genesis chapter 12 and verse 5, 75 years old was when Abraham's journey was just beginning. But even with all of that wealth, what was Abraham really looking for? Why did he step out of his comfort zone and migrate out of that highly sophisticated ancient city? What was his true heart's desire? It wasn't in the things that are temporal, but in the things that are eternal. According to Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 7, when he left Ur, his name changed from Abraham, which means father of height, to Abraham, the father of many nations. And in the Holy Scriptures, when a name is changed, there is a change of character. According to Hebrews chapter 11 verses 8 to 10, it reads, "By faith Abraham, when he was called out to go into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance," guess what? Obeyed. "And he went out not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in a land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise." But what was he looking for? What was the aim of his migration? For he looked for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is, guess who? God. Where is that city? "But ye are come into Mount Sion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels. Revelation chapter 21 verses 1 to 4 elaborates, and it reads, And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them. And they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them, and be their God. And God shall wipe away not some, but all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. This is what the patriarch Abraham was looking forward to. But before those tears are wiped, the spiritual seed of the children of Abraham have to face a number of trials and obstacles if we are to sincerely secure our place in eternity. So we have looked at the past by observing the creation and the fall and its effects. Now we're going to look at the future by going through the book of Revelation from chapters 1 to 22 in 1 hour. I'm going to show you how to study this book by following a principle called text upon text. This is not for the faint-hearted. This is for people who are very serious about what's going on in the world and for people who really want to have a personal relationship with God. So please fasten your seatbelts and take your notes. On a building opposite Bank Station in central London's infamous Square Mile, at the top in between pagan iconography are the words of a popular psalm that reads, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." This planet we call Earth, as recorded in Genesis chapter 1, didn't appear by a random chance but was created. But in the book of Revelation it prophesies that it will be recreated over again. But before we go into that prophetic book, the first book that mentions that recreation of a new earth is a book titled Yeshayahu, or in English, Isaiah, which means God is salvation. It is the most preserved manuscript of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a National Geographic magazine December 2018 edition documented that no matter how many times that it has been translated, the modern English translation still perfectly aligns to the original text. Recent discoveries in the 21st century have unearthed two seals written in 8th century BC Hebrew. The one on the left has the name Hezekiah written on it, and the one on the right has the name of Isaiah. King Hezekiah of the southern kingdom of Judah was one of the few Hebrew monarchs that introduced a spiritual revival. His name has also been preserved on an Assyrian artifact of his enemy in the British Museum, where it records in cuneiform text that Hezekiah gave a tribute of gold and silver to the Assyrian monarch that is also accurately preserved in 2 Kings chapter 18 and verse 14. Scholars are also recognizing that one of the writers who preserved King Hezekiah's name, who also prayed with him and gave him counsel, was the 8th century BC prophet Isaiah, who, alongside the Psalms, is the most quoted authority throughout the whole of the New Testament, starting from Matthew chapter 1 verses 21 to 23, all the way to Revelation chapter 21 verses 1 to 4. Jesus quoted from Isaiah in Luke chapter 4 verses 16 to 21 after he was both baptized and tempted in the wilderness, to show to us where he did fit in to prophetic time. The prophet Isaiah introduces to us the descendants of Ashur, whose skilled military strategist monarchs developed the ferocious Assyrian Empire. Their artwork was amazing, where they could neatly carve into stone one of the most detailed and sophisticated forms of naturalistic art in the ancient world. And despite their renowned nationwide reputation for cruelty, not long before their vast empire collapsed, they humbled themselves and their hard hearts softened towards the worship of God, as documented in Jonah chapter 3 and verse 5. And Jesus also tells us in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 41 that they will rise in the first resurrection. Isaiah records the successive father-to-son Assyrian dynasty, beginning with King Sargon II, as recorded in Isaiah chapter 20 and verse 1, whose bust is neatly preserved in a dark corner of the Assyrian section in the British Museum. He was succeeded by his son Sennacherib, as recorded in Isaiah chapter 36 and verse 1, who is also on display in the British Museum. He tried to blaspheme God, and he ended up being assassinated by two of his own sons. In the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, is the bust of Ashur-nadim Shuri, who was Sennacherib's direct successor, but he was assassinated also. So his brother, King Esarhaddon, as recorded in Isaiah chapter 37 and verse 38, whose busts are in both the British Museum and in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, Germany, took his place and became king, who was famous for his conquering of Egypt. The Pergamon Museum also houses a bust of a Babylonian monarch who was twice defeated by both Esarhaddon's father and grandfather, Marduk-Baladan, or as recorded in Isaiah chapter 39 and verse 1, Merodach-Baladan. God was not impressed that King Hezekiah formed an unholy alliance with this heathen monarch, and prophesied that his kingdom would eventually be overthrown by the Babylonians. But there was an alliance that God strangely did not condemn. On the Nile Valley in the Sudan in northeast Africa was an empire that scholars are now beginning to take seriously, even if it is only a rare one-off 2008 study that was presented to the public by National Geographic. Despite modern Eurasian scholarship's cunning attempts to deliberately erase them out of the living memory of ancient human history, God in his infinite wisdom saw it fit to preserve the record of one of its most famous monarchs. Taharqa, as written in the Egyptian hieroglyphics, was a 25th Egyptian dynasty monarch who was from the Sudan, and is called Taharqa in the Holy Scriptures, as recorded in Isaiah chapter 37 and verse 9. This descendant of Cush's accession was 690 BC, and despite his double cobra headdress, he is one of the few heathen monarchs who God does not condemn for having an alliance with the king of Judah, Hezekiah. Why? Because when God sent an angel to wipe out King Sennacherib's army, King Taharqa's military also weakened the Assyrian army's invasion of Jerusalem, where unbeknownst to him, he protected the southern kingdom of Judah from subjugation of the Assyrians and preserved the lineage of the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So if Isaiah can safely be relied upon as an accurate account of the past, we can confidently trust it to tell us about the details of the future. It may be very difficult for us to imagine living in a world where the carnivorous Eurasian North American mammal, the wolf, will live peacefully alongside the herbivore Eurasian baby sheep, the lamb, or the herbivore mammal, the bullock, eating the same diet as two of the most feared killers in the animal kingdom, the carnivorous lion and the hunting reptile, the snake. But in Isaiah chapter 65 verses 17 and 25, it tells that in the future, for behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered nor come into mind. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like the bullock, and dust shall be the serpent's meat. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, saith the Lord. It was Isaiah before John who was the first to also mention that there will be no more death, and God shall wipe away all of our tears. But it also tells us something that will be restored in the new earth. In Afro-Eurasia, the spiritual seed of Abraham after Pentecost throughout Christendom kept this early institution. In Ethiopia, in the Horn of Africa, this church, whose brilliant buildings built from the top down, that still baffles modern engineers and architects, kept this institution the longest. In Asia, the Assyrian Empire's descendants, the Nestorian church that once stretched all the way from Iraq to China, also kept it. And in Northern Europe, the Celtic church in Ireland and Scotland also preserved this ancient institution. And though their later successors in the British Isles did not keep it, some of them still recognize its importance as a memorial of creation. The 17th century English poet and statesman John Milton said, with regard to the Sabbath, it is clear that God hallowed it to himself and dedicated it to rest in remembrance of the consummation of his work. He quotes Genesis chapter 2 verses 2 and 3 and Exodus chapter 31 verse 17. The Sabbath of the Lord is truly honourable, Welsh-born nonconformist minister Matthew Henry said, and we have reason to honour it. Honour it for the sake of its antiquity, its great author, the sanctification of the first Sabbath by the Holy God himself, and by our first appearance in innocency in obedience to him. He has separated and distinguished it from the rest of the days of the week, and he has consecrated it and set it apart to himself and his own service and honour. The Sabbath was the first positive revelation of the duty of worship, Scotsman J.A. Wiley said in the 19th century. It was a revelation not in the form of a precept, but in the form of institution. The Sabbath taught man that his time was not all his own. A seventh of it belonged to his Maker, and was to be spent in his special and formal service. Labour was to cease, not a tree was to be pruned, nor a flower was to be dressed that day in paradise. And relieved from his wonted toil, light or heavy as might be, man was to pass the time in spiritual communings with his Maker, and in such works of beneficence or acts of devotion as God might appoint. So Isaiah prophesied that, "For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one highlighted in red Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord." This is what has been prepared for the future. But there is a book that goes into much more deeper detail of the victories and the battles we will have to face before we reach that future Eden, and we shall attempt to unlock its symbolic codes.
The COVID-19 crisis has shown us that our old systems are not fit anymore for the 21st century. We can build a new social contract. In short, we need a great reset.
Consensus is partnering with central banks, retail banks, fintech institutions, and blockchain innovators to help develop what's called a central bank digital currency, or CBDC.
Yi2 is creating the building blocks for a smart city of the future, where facial recognition is part of everyday life. This could even extend to detecting what people are thinking.
Is coronavirus turning us into a cashless society?
You know, we're living at a moment in time where the world is a very uncertain and anxious place.
Well, we know that this coronavirus has certainly put pressure on so many of us across the world.
500 million people risk falling into poverty because of the coronavirus pandemic.
Similarly, I wonder, and I don't say this with any assuredness, I wonder whether the world's economies will have to be somehow artificially kept afloat for the rest of time.
Freedom of expression gets put to the test once again.
Curfew is now in effect. All unauthorized citizens must stay indoors.
Tensions rise as we enter the 213th week of lockdown.
Thermal scan normal.
Horrifying new development today.
New data confirms the virus attack. Armed guards will be arriving in 4 to 6 hours. You must not attempt to leave your home, or you will be shot on sight.
Liverpool, the setting for a pilot scheme to run regular tests for as many people as possible.
As you say, we're going to be using the armed forces. So from Thursday, there'll be 2,000 armed forces personnel in and around the city.
But the plan is to build from there with people being tested once or twice every week.
The nations are very angry. Racial tensions flare in the Americas. Police abuses continue. Terror alerts are high. Nations are warring with each other, even doing music videos promoting their military as a threat to surrounding nations. And when you unnecessarily lock down a vast number of the population of the planet, crippling economies of people who are already living in poverty and are struggling to make a decent living, people will violently revolt. The UK's Express newspaper in May 2020 highlighted a EU-funded comic titled Infected, published in the year 2012, that shows a virus from a Chinese lab that infected the whole world that brought in a global lockdown, and the EU are the ones who save the day. That's interesting. As different studies are being published by credible think tanks of the true devastating effects of not the casualties of COVID-19, but the global lockdown, we are seeing something more dark and sinister at play. It has led to many already autocratic regimes to be even more dictatorial, and even so-called democratic states are subtly turning into dictatorships, most of them taking their orders from the invisible government. They are using abusive powers on their civilian populations and doing as they please at will with no accountability, where no one is allowed to challenge or question a thing, and even powerful figures who usually are not a target are also under pressure. Qualified doctors and seasoned journalists all over the world who are bravely speaking out against the main COVID-19 lockdown narrative are sadly being jailed indefinitely. The odd modern journal will record their cries. They are also using fear tactics. The narrator filmed this sign in London's Waterloo Station, where you can be fined up to £6,400 if you are not wearing a face mask while on your travels. This is the Great Reset. But where is this all leading to? Is this restructuring of the entire planet a part of a much wider, well-planned agenda? Well, there is something that gives us great insight. What if you had a unique compass that could safely navigate you through the past, the present, and the future, if its instructions were followed carefully? There is one. And on the Greek island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, a panoramic view of human history was detailed in a book originally titled Apocalypsis, but better known today as Revelation, that forewarned of a global lockdown where no man cannot buy or sell. The entire message of the book is to prepare a fallen world for the second coming of Christ, which is the grand finale of all Bible prophecies. And it is not just for the church only, but a dire warning to the whole world also, and as already mentioned, the promise of a brand new heaven and a brand new earth. It gives a detailed history of the church from the days of the apostles to the last generation, beginning with Ephesus, who is presented as an uncompromising, zealous, apostolic, Bible-believing church. It was succeeded by Smyrna, who suffers under harsh persecution, beginning with the reign of Nero, as this painting in an art gallery shows. It then goes into the deep idolatrous, backsliding apostasy of Pergamos and Thyatira that began under Constantine, who sacrificed unto idols and caused people to commit spiritual fornication and turn men's minds away from God back to idols. It talks of a spiritual revival under the church of Sardis during the Reformation, of men which have not defiled their garments with false doctrines, and another revival with the church of Philadelphia, which means brotherly love, because thou hast kept the word of my patience. But the last church, Laodicea, which means people of judgment, are a bunch of hypocrites, who are described as lukewarm, who are physically rich but spiritually poor, who are increased with goods and think that they have need of nothing. This is a very detailed and pinpoint accurate description of the backsliding, lukewarm mainstream churches of today. They are interested in prosperity and wealth than a true conversion experience and winning souls for eternity. But even in their empty churches, God still has mercy upon them. In order to fully grasp Revelation, you'll have to do some deep time travel, for it is written in a prophetic style called typology, which just means in a nutshell history repeating itself. So historical events in the Old Testament are to be repeated over again, where modern corrupt Western governments are modelled on ancient corrupt ones. So in literal Egypt, there was a defiance against God, and guess what? Plagues were fallen. It will be repeated over again. Babylon was a kingdom in the Orient, the East, but it is to receive a new facelift, and its ideas are to be resurrected by a new spiritual Babylon that is geographically situated in the Occident, the West. The narrator will give a few biblical examples of typology. These artifacts in the British Museum show a deity that is half lion and half eagle, which is how the ancient kingdom of Babylon is prophetically described in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 4. The late Pope John Paul II has a mitre with the Babylonian lion with eagle's wings, as the Papacy inherited the custom of that culture according to Revelation chapter 13 and verse 2. This Assyrian monarch in the British Museum has the adopted mitre from Babylon with a golden cup in his hand. And this Pope in St. John's Lateran Church in Rome has the exact same Babylonian mitre, who also has a golden cup in his hand. In Jeremiah chapter 51 and verse 7, it describes literal Babylon's golden cup that corrupts the surrounding nations. And in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 4, spiritual Babylon also has a golden cup that also corrupts the nations. This artifact in the British Museum documents the Medo-Persian invasion of Babylon. And in Isaiah chapter 21 and verse 9, and also in Jeremiah chapter 51 and verse 8, it prophesied the overthrow of literal Babylon. And in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8 and chapter 18 and verse 2, it also forewarns the fall of spiritual Babylon using the exact same prophetic language. Babylon is fallen, is fallen. God instructed Abraham to come out of Ur of the Chaldees, that was in the geographical location of Nimrod's kingdom of Babylon, to go into the literal land of Canaan. In Jeremiah chapter 51 and verse 6, God told literal Israel to come out of literal Babylon to avoid being morally corrupted by its culture. And in Revelation chapter 18 and verse 4, God again forewarns spiritual Israel to also come out of spiritual Babylon, so that she also is not morally corrupted before she enters into the heavenly Canaan. In Daniel chapter 3 verses 5 and 6, King Nebuchadnezzar II passed a decree in his province to worship an image, and whoever did not would be killed. In Revelation chapter 13 and verse 15, a global decree will be passed for the whole world to again worship the image, and whoever does not bow will be again killed. In Judges chapter 5 and verse 19, God defeated the Canaanite army at the Battle of Megiddo. In the future global worldwide Battle of Megiddo, in Revelation chapter 16 and verse 16, God is going to intervene over again. In Joshua chapter 10 and verse 11, just before the children of Israel entered into Canaan, God dropped hailstones on the huge army that wanted to destroy them. And in Revelation chapter 16 verse 21, history will be repeated just before the faithful enter into the heavenly Canaan.
Is this Clark, this interstellar comet?
Right? I mean,
yeah, big news.
Whoa! Where are they going?
I don't know. When the first chunk is about to hit.
Hit?
Only part of it. It's going in the ocean.
2.
Would you look at that?
1.
Wait, where's the explosion?
If you are hearing this broadcast, seek shelter immediately.
The global 7 last plagues are a repeat of the plagues of Egypt. The sores, the blood, the darkness, and the frogs. So the book of Revelation encourages you to study the Old or the First Testament. For if you really want to understand what is taking place in the present and what will happen in the future, you have to know what has taken place in the past. There are a few more principles that need to be taken into consideration in order to clearly understand the book of Revelation. Isaiah chapter 28 and verse 20 teaches that when we are studying, we are to carefully follow each precept and look at each verse line upon line. And 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 13 says we have to compare spiritual things with spiritual by cross-referencing one text with another. Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 8 is clear that you have to give the sense and cause the people to understand the reading if you are a teacher of prophecy. But if you are a student of prophecy, Acts chapter 17 and verse 11 says you must receive the word with all readiness of mind, and you must search the scriptures how often? Daily, whether those things are so. Why? Because 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 5 says that your faith is never ever meant to depend upon no mortal man, but solely in the power of God. Because if you depend upon any man, according to Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 5, God is not happy, for individuals can manipulate vulnerable people. So Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2 says we must only look unto Jesus, who is the author and finisher of our faith. For as Jesus makes it unequivocally clear in Luke chapter 24 and verse 44, that all Bible prophecies are perfectly fulfilled in him, and that when it is fulfilled, you will have more confidence in him, according to John chapter 13 and verse 19. So any study on the book of Revelation where Jesus is not the center is an absolute waste of time, for it is Jesus who is revealing himself to his saints through prophecy, and he is the one who is guiding us through time, according to Revelation chapter 1 verses 1 to 3. Jesus revealed himself to both John and Daniel when both temples in Jerusalem were destroyed, and he describes himself as having feet and arms like the color of brass, a golden girdle and eyes like flames of fire, and we are given back what our forefather forfeited. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 24, the tree of life was taken from man, but in Revelation, the tree of life is given back to those who sincerely want to be in eternity. We shall quote two British historicist prophetic scholars to solidify his points. A member of the English Parliament and the head of the Corpus Christi College in the University of Oxford, whose remains are in Bunhill Fields, the burial ground in the City of London for radical thinkers, was a 17th century Cambridge-educated English Puritan, nonconformist preacher and theologian whose multi-volume collection teaches us how to correctly understand the laws of prophetic interpretation. And Thomas Goodwin taught that the Revelation of Jesus Christ is a book containing the affairs of the world and of the church, and God decrees about them both. The Revelation, speaking in the language of the Old Testament and the types thereof, calls true believers Jews and the Israel of God. The church is a woman, the two witnesses. The Revelation takes all the eminent visions of the Old Testament and makes use of them. Was there an Egypt, a Sodom, a Babylon? Here also is one far worse than all those were. Had they a Jerusalem? The Revelation had a better, a new Jerusalem. Jesus prophesied the destruction of the old Jerusalem to prepare for the new Jerusalem in the new earth. And the Romans who fulfilled that prophecy in AD 66 to 70 preserved that episode of history on their timeless monuments. But there are some very influential and prominent US evangelicals whose predictions never seem to come to pass, with a dispensationalist, futurist, eschatological worldview who believe in the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple. This idea can be traced right back to Francisco Ribera, the 16th century Spanish Jesuit theologian, who falsely taught as a clever distraction the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. And there are sadly millions of Christians all around the world, as well as one of the fundamental principles of American foreign policy, who believe in this false interpretation of Bible prophecy. In a book published in 1878 titled The Approaching End of the Age, the Irish-born British Protestant missionary and preacher Dr. Henry Grattan Guinness, continuing the school of thought of Thomas Goodwin, said that the Bible is the only book in the world that gives us a view of human history as a whole, that carries us from the lost paradise of Eden to the restored paradise of the Apocalypse, tracing the course of the human race through every stage of the intermediate existence of the earth, and on beyond the limits of time into the boundless regions of eternity, from the creation and fall of man to the final judgment and the inauguration of the new heavens and the new earth. In short, a personal advent of Christ is the theme, the main theme of the whole Bible. In the Apocalypse, Jewish imagery, as Thomas Goodwin said, is symbolic. These things are used as signs. The candlestick was one feature of the tabernacle and the temple economy, in which every feature was typical of heavenly things. Many other symbols borrowed from the same system appear in the Apocalypse. This one key unlocks them all. A knowledge of history is needful to the intelligent comprehension of prophecy. Prophecy is God telling us beforehand what shall happen. Authentic history is men telling us what has, in the providence of God, taken place. So we have to have a thorough knowledge of world history in order to fully understand the book of Revelation. And as we shall see during this study, some major world events are foretold in that prophetic book centuries before they took place in the earth. And just as men took painstaking efforts to decipher the ancient Egyptian language, with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone currently in the British Museum, deciphered by both the English linguist Thomas Young on the right and the French linguist Jean-Francois Chapolon on the left, we have to also take time and patience to decipher the prophetic symbolism in the book of Revelation. So stars symbolically represent angels according to Revelation chapter 1 and verse 20, chapter 12 and verse 4, or a leader in Genesis chapter 37 and verse 9, and Numbers chapter 24 and verse 17, depending on the context. A dragon symbolically represents Satan according to Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9, chapter 20 and verse 2, or an earthly leader in Ezekiel chapter 29 and verse 3. Water symbolically represents people, multitudes, nations, and tongues in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 15. A day symbolically represents a year according to Numbers chapter 14 and verse 34 and Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 6. A beast symbolically represents a king or a kingdom according to Daniel chapter 7 verses 17 and 23 and chapter 8 and verse 4. A horn symbolically represents a king or a kingdom according to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 24, chapter 8 verses 20 and 21, and Revelation chapter 17 and verse 12. A temple symbolically represents the church according to 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 16 and 17, chapter 6 and verse 19, and 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 16. And a woman symbolically represents a church, a virgin in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 2, and a whore in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1. The church, when she was persecuted, was symbolically described as both a woman and the two witnesses. But who are the two witnesses? Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 20 said the foundation of God's church is built upon the prophets, which is the Old or First Testament, and the apostles and Jesus Christ, which is the gospel. Jesus in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 14 calls the gospel a witness, and in Acts chapter 10 and verse 43 Peter calls the prophets a witness. So these are the two witnesses, God's church. The church is also symbolized as the 7-branch candlestick according to Revelation chapter 1 and verse 20. And Jesus already laid that foundation of using something literal to explain something spiritual when explaining salvation in the Gospels. So the Gospels and Revelation both complement each other. In the parable of the sower, Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 8 and verse 11 that the seed, literal, represents the word of God, spiritual. When it grows and it's time to pick it, that's the harvest. And Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 39 that the harvest is the end of the world. This is when the farmer comes to pick and gather in his wheat, to both sell and to eat it. He cuts it with his sharp sickle, and that which is of no use is piled up by a fork, also known as a fan, and the tares or the chaff is burned up at the end of the harvest. How is Jesus' second coming described as? John the Baptist said he will gather his wheat, his true people, and with his fan he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire in Matthew chapter 3 and verse 12. This chaff symbolically represents the ungodly and the wicked, and in Revelation chapter 14 verse 14, he is coming with a crown, so he's coming back as a king, and with a sickle, he's also coming back as a farmer. Our ears were created to pick up the different frequencies of sounds, and in both Mark chapter 4 and verse 23 and Revelation chapter 13 and verse 9 it reads, "Whoever has ears, let him hear." Our eyes come in a variety of different colors, and they were designed so we can see what is going on all around us. The sun was created not only to distinguish the different seasons, but that we can also use it to tell the time, and modern day instruments help in telling the time also. And in both Matthew chapter 24 and verse 42 and in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 3, they both instruct that we must watch so we know the hour of Christ's second coming. Sometimes a thief will come in the day, but he is most effective at night, for that is when you least expect him to invade your private space. And for those who will not prepare for the second coming of Christ, in both Matthew chapter 24 and verse 43 and in Revelation chapter 16 and verse 15, this is how Christ describes his second coming as a thief. When a woman is looking for a man to settle down with to become her future husband for life, she wants a man who is handsome, independent, and can stand on his own 2 feet. A man also wants a woman who can also hold her own, is not miserable, attractive, and one who usually looks like him. But some people do branch outside of their cultural or ethnic group. They then both court for a while to familiarize themselves with each other so they can know who they are settling down with. And then that big day comes with all the guests. Behold, the bridegroom cometh. In both Matthew chapter 22 and verse 2 and Revelation chapter 19 and verse 9, Jesus describes his second coming as a marriage. Let us prepare ourselves for the greatest wedding in history. Many different ethnic groups can integrate with no problems. But we do sadly live in a world where people are so desperate to have a racial identity that it creates a lot of problems. But at the second coming, all of those racial divisions will be totally irrelevant. For when Jesus Christ returns, he describes how the lost will react in both Matthew chapter 24 and verse 30 and Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7. They are all going to be absolutely terrified as they all made a conscious decision to be eternally lost. But on the Isle of Patmos, Revelation also foretells us of different things that will take place in heaven and political and religious movements that will take place and influence the earth before the second coming of Christ that will lead up to a global lockdown. This is where studying typology is important. Archaeology has continued to verify that the battle in Jericho recorded in the book of Joshua perfectly aligns with the archaeological excavation at the site as they continue to find more and more evidence. Jericho was known as the City of Palms, has one of the oldest known human settlements on Earth, the first and oldest public building ever found known as the first skyscraper, the oldest town on Earth, and the oldest known freaky looking face mask. Before the children of Israel entered the Promised Land, an instrument was used to topple the ancient city walls of Jericho. In Joshua chapter 6 and verse 4, God instructed 7 trumpets of ram's horns to be used in the fall of Jericho. And in Revelation chapter 8 and verse 2, 7 trumpets are also used again, but this time as a warning message that predicts the destruction of the Roman Empire through 7 successive stages. Trumpets in Numbers chapter 10 were used for the calling of the assembly, a gathering together, for feasts, an alarm, and for war. And anytime we are meant to give a message of warning, we're meant to raise our voices like a trumpet, according to Isaiah chapter 58 and verse 1. Now, incense in the Holy Scriptures represents our prayers according to Psalms 141 and verse 2. And the golden altar to burn incense on earth in Exodus chapter 30 and verse 1 was a model of the real one in heaven in Revelation chapter 8 and verse 3. And one man knew its function and its connection to Christ's ministerial role as our high priest. In a small house just outside of London, a man who has been previously quoted while blind compiled a book titled Paradise Lost, known as one of the greatest literary works in the Western world. And John Milton said, "With incense where the golden altar fumed, by the great intercessor came in sight, before the Father's throne then the glad Son, presenting thus to intercede, began." He knew what it meant. The ark and the mercy seat symbolically represented God's throne who sits between the cherubims. And in Exodus chapter 26 verses 33 and 34, we are given a description of the ark and where it was to be located on earth. And it was also a model of what was already located in the temple in heaven, according to Revelation chapter 11 and verse 19. In London's Westminster Cathedral are the remains of a man who understood its significance. He worked at the Royal Mint, is known for helping us understand the law of optics, the elliptic shapes of the planetary bodies, and also the scientific laws of gravity, where his discoveries are preserved behind a glass case in London's Science Museum. But it was prophecy Sir Isaac Newton had the most interest in, and in his 1733 posthumous publication, this English mathematician wrote that the 7th trumpet sounds to the battle of the great day of God Almighty, whereby the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of the Lord and of his Christ, and those are destroyed that destroyed the earth. The interpretation begins with the words, "And the temple of God was opened, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament," and it continues to the end of the prophecy. The temple is the scene of the visions, and the visions in the temple relate to the feast of the 7th month, for the feasts of the Jews were typical, that is, typology of things to come. The Passover related to the first coming of Christ and the feast of the 7th month to his second coming, his first coming being therefore over before this prophecy was given. The feasts of the 7th month are here alluded unto. In a volume of books titled The Family Expositor, the 18th century English nonconformist minister Philip Doddridge also said, "Upon the sounding of the seventh angel in both Revelation chapter 10 and verse 7 and chapter 11 and verse 15, the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the veil which seemed to separate the most holy place being drawn aside, the ark of his covenant appeared in his temple, to signify further manifestations of the divine presence which were now to be made." Both of these men understood typology. But how do they connect the seventh trumpet, the ark, the temple, and the feasts of the seventh month to the second coming of Christ? The Passover in Leviticus chapter 23 verses 4 and 5 does point to Christ's first coming in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. For that Passover lamb without blemish in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 5 points us to Christ, the complete sacrifice without blemish in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 19. And in Leviticus on the feast of the seventh month, the Day of Atonement, the Holy Scripture said that no man can enter the tabernacle until the high priest comes out. And in Revelation chapter 15 and verse 8, when Jesus Christ has completed his intercessory role as our high priest in heaven, according to Psalms 110 and verse 1 and 4, repeated again it says, no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. Same thing. But before the completion of the seventh trumpet, these 6 British prophetic scholars from clockwise, Thomas Goodwin top left, Sir Isaac Newton top centre, Philip Doddridge top right, Alexander Keith bottom right, Bishop Thomas Newton bottom centre, and Robert Fleming the Younger bottom left, all knew the political meaning of what each trumpet represented here on earth, and one man knew its significance in detail. The first 4 trumpets in Revelation chapter 8, Wiley says, includes those eruptions of the barbarous nations of the north by which the Western Roman Empire was completely destroyed. Accordingly, each trumpet announced the descent of a new calamity upon the unhappy empire. Leaving, then, the Western world, the scene changes to the east in Revelation chapter 9. The first woe of Revelation chapter 8 and verse 13 was to happen under the 5th trumpet, the second under the 6th trumpet, and the third and last under the 7th trumpet. So Attila the Hun on the left, Genseric, king of the Vandals, in the center, and Odoacer on the right were 3 of the 4 trumpets that toppled the Western Roman Empire by a war in Revelation chapter 8. But a movement, symbolically described as a swarm of locusts, succeeded them in Revelation chapter 9 and toppled the Eastern Roman Empire. Who did these Western prophetic scholars identify as fulfilling that prophecy? The 5th trumpet of Revelation chapter 9 and verse 1, which is the first of the 3 woes in Revelation chapter 8 and verse 13, these British scholars identified as the rise of Islam. Muhammad they identified as being that star or leader whose Arab armies invaded the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Being successful with the animal they are still renowned for breeding in Revelation chapter 9 verses 7 and 9, the Arab horse. They were also known for their very long hair and big beards, as they are accurately described in Revelation chapter 9 verses 8 and 9, as can be seen by these Arabs in the British Museum who have long hair like women and big beards. But how did these prophetic scholars know for sure that those swarms of locusts symbolically represented the Arabs? It is because of studying typology. In the famous Highgate Cemetery in the north of London are the buried remains of a 19th century English lexicographer who was knighted by Queen Victoria. Sir William Smith was the editor of the 1865 Concise Dictionary of the Bible that had 65 contributors, and in the narrator's humble opinion, it is the best Bible dictionary in the English-speaking world. And it read that Midian, a son of Abraham and Keturah, is the progenitor of the Midianites, or Arabians dwelling principally in the desert north of the peninsula in Arabia. And in Judges chapter 7 and verse 12, the Arabian tribe, the Midianites, are described as grasshoppers in number, another name for the family of locusts, just as the Arabs were described in Revelation chapter 9. When the Mohammedan power was beginning to weaken in the west at the final battle of Granada in 1492, ending 780 years of Islamic rule in the Iberian Peninsula in Portugal and Spain, another Mohammedan power was rising up under the prophetic sixth trumpet, the second woe, that conquered the eastern part of the Roman Empire, emerging from the infamous River Euphrates. And Sultan Gazi Othman was the founder of the empire that was to be named after him. It was the Ottoman Empire. In Kensal Green Cemetery on London's Harrow Road is the grave of John Cassell, a 19th century publisher, printer, writer, editor, health reformer and abolitionist. A huge Bible bears his name, and on its footnote a commentary on Revelation chapter 9 and verse 13 reads that the sixth angel sounded in April 1453. Muhammad II, otherwise named the Slayer of Man, invested Constantinople with his army. The fortifications, which had stood for ages against hostile victories, were dismantled on all sides by the Ottoman cannon, and on May 29, 1453, Constantinople was taken, its empire subverted, and its religion trampled in the dust by its cruel and oppressive conquerors. So the Ottomans are known as one of the first to use gunpowder in war, which is the fire and smoke and brimstone of Revelation chapter 9 and verse 17. And according to Sir Edward Creasy, the 19th century English jurist and historian, he wrote that it was Muhammad II, the Ottoman Turkish Sultan, who overthrew Constantinople in 1453, and the Ottoman Turks fulfilled the prophecy of the sixth trumpet of Revelation chapter 9. But there was another prophecy that was clearly identified before it even took place. It was the French Revolution, and its defiance against God, like Pharaoh, in the language of typology, was spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. Men were able to foresee that a revolution was to take place in France in the 10th part of the city of Revelation chapter 11 and verse 13. They were Thomas Goodwin, who foresaw it a century before, Robert Fleming Jr. and Bishop Thomas Newton. But it was an influential French Protestant leader, Pierre Giraud, who fled persecution in France, that knew that the country of his birth was going to fall. And he documented and said, "Now what is this 10th part of the city which shall fall? In my opinion, we cannot doubt that it is France. This 10th part of the city shall fall with respect to the papacy. It shall break with Rome and the Roman religion." So from a historical perspective that will align with prophecy, how did the largest country in Europe turn from being a strong Catholic nation, beginning with Clovis, to a nation of atheists under the influence of the Enlightenment philosopher, historian and writer Voltaire? The French leaders, under the instruction of successive popes, beginning with the persecution and crusades of the Albigenses, would purge out any trace of apostolic Bible-based Christianity that threatened papal authority. And when the Reformation swept throughout Europe, it met harsh resistance in France, with constant persecution against the French Protestant community, who were labelled the Huguenots. The Catholic Church wanted no trace of the apostolic religion in her midst, and did all that it could to annihilate it from France. The most famous of her purges was in the year 1572, the infamous St. Bartholomew's Massacre, that started with the murder of Gaspard de Coligny, the Protestant leader, then instantly followed with a massacre of hundreds and thousands of Protestant men, women and children, who were murdered under the instructions of Diego Lainez, the Black Pope, the Spanish Superior General of the Jesuits. And Pope Gregory XIII struck a medal in commemoration to glorify the murder of Protestants by Catholics. The Edict of Nantes was signed by King Henry IV in 1598 to give Protestant Huguenots religious and civil liberties. This Huguenot king, who converted to Catholicism for political reasons, was eventually assassinated for his good deeds, and King Louis XIV, his grandson, on the advice of his Jesuit confessor Pierre Lachaise, revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, and a terrible persecution was enacted by the king throughout the whole of France, with his brutal military called the Dragonnades, who forced the Protestants to renounce their faith by gunpoint. Many fled from France in record numbers, and this highly industrious community boosted nearly every economy of the European countries they fled to, which was to weaken the economy of France. A British newspaper recently documented that they were the most successful immigrants to the UK, and in places like Wandsworth in the south of London, there is a burial ground that was almost recently destroyed and is now being refurbished that still has the remains of those French Protestant Huguenot refugees who fled the persecution of King Louis XIV at the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. In Fan Street in London's Barbican, it is named after the French Huguenot fan makers, where this building next to a synagogue has a plaque with their historic legacy. They also once held religious services around the corner from there, where their presence was felt throughout the city of London. The obstetrical forceps, once used in European midwifery, was an invention created by and introduced to the UK by a French Huguenot immigrant family, the Chamberlains. The most famous was Dr. Peter Chamberlain, the well-travelled 17th century Cambridge-educated medical doctor, who was the royal physician for the Stuart monarchs, King James I and IV, King Charles I and King Charles II. He lived in Woodmortimer Hall in the English county of Essex that still has the family name, and he is buried in the grounds of the church next to his house, where his grave tells us not only of the monarchs he was a physician to at the top, but his beliefs. For at the bottom it reads, as for his religion, he was a Christian keeping the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, being baptized about the year 1648 and keeping the seventh day for the Sabbath, the same beliefs as the narrator. London's Chelsea Embankment and down the river Victoria Embankment were built in the 19th century to protect London from being overflooded by sewage, and this led to the advent of public toilets in the UK that are now almost non-existent. When you flush the toilet in London, England, the waste all goes into the sewers into these huge pipes in the east of London, where this building controls all of London's waste. The man who was responsible for building London's drainage system and embankments is the little-known English civil engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, whose monument is in London's Embankment, and whose grandfather was also a French Huguenot immigrant to the UK. Sir Austin Henry Layard, the British politician, historian and archaeologist who reintroduced the ancient Assyrians to the modern world, was also a descendant of the Huguenots and a member of London's Huguenot Society, and the impact is still felt with us to this day. According to London's Financial Times, watchmaking in France created an industry which almost came to a premature end with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. It forced hundreds of skilled watchmakers who were Protestant Huguenots to flee into Switzerland over the Jura Mountains. The leading producers of watches in the world today are the Swiss watchmakers, an industry in Switzerland that was either founded or developed by the Protestant Huguenot refugees who used their gifted talents in communities that appreciated them. And as France continued to kick out its most industrious community, you can only imagine what happened to its economy. The purging of the Protestant community to preserve the wealth and power of papal domination that increased the poverty in France is one of the main key factors that led men to behead people and to fanatically turn on the aristocracy that led to the reign of terror in France. And while he tells us that the millions that France lavished in these crusades and the hundreds of thousands of virtuous and industrious citizens whom she banished from her territory can never be accurately told, but one thing is manifest, that in these proceedings she sowed the seeds of the frightful calamities she has since endured and is now enduring. The revolution spread to France's next door neighbour in Italy, the Papacy. And when the English Catholic historian Lord Acton said power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, it can be rightly said that he was describing the Papacy. This system's power today is greatly overlooked and underestimated. Despite her dark legacy of sexual abuse that will forever haunt her, she is cleverly boosting her profile with some of the most powerful shows and with some of the most powerful musicians and actors, making cameo appearances in these shows with some of the leading vigilante superheroes adorned with prayer beads and in the attire of a Catholic nun in the infamous graphic novel series, The Watchmen. Though Guy Fawkes is historically known as an English Catholic villain who attempted to blow up the Protestant nobility in Parliament in 1605, the 2005 film V for Vendetta, exactly 400 years later, turned him into a national hero, and the whole world now adorns their face with the mask of a renowned Catholic terrorist, the #1 iconic figure of modern revolution, who replaced the face of the Argentinian Marxist Che Guevara. When the final showdown takes place on earth, all roads will lead to Rome. And in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 8 and chapter 17 and verse 8, it prophesied that eventually the entire world will one day give their complete homage to the Papacy, whose names are not written in the book of life. The book of life is first mentioned in Exodus chapter 32, verses 32 and 33, and then in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1 in the Old or First Testament. It is a book that is in heaven that has the names of all those who have accepted the invitation to be in eternity forever, according to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 3, and Revelation chapter 3 and verse 5. And it will be a book that will determine where each person wants their future destiny, according to the description of the day of judgment in Revelation chapter 20, verses 12 and 15. But the papacy's rise, temporal fall, and restoration again is detailed in Revelation chapter 13. Historians are now confirming how powerful she once was in her peak, when all the leading monarchs in Europe could not become crowned without her endorsement. Her temporal supremacy began with Emperor Justinian's decree in 538 AD, the start of the 42 prophetic months, the times and a half, and the 1,260 days which were prophetic years, that ended in 1798, when the French government of Napoleon Bonaparte on the right, his general Louis-Alexandre Berthier on the left, took Pope Pius VI in the centre, captive in 1798 in prophetic precision. Papal supremacy had come to a halt. Never in her history had she received such a devastating blow and humiliation. But when she was taken into captivity in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 10 by her oldest child France, according to Revelation chapter 13 and verse 11, around the same time in the late 18th century, another power was rising up in its embryonic stages. And when it fully matures, its only role on the prophetic map is to eventually use all of its economic, military, and political power and religious influence to make the entire world worship the papacy by force, using some kind of very enticing supernatural apparatus that will coerce men's minds, and also some very heavy global economic sanctions. What nation qualifies?
Make America great again.
We remain the greatest nation in the history of civilization.
The American Republic stands today as the greatest, most exceptional, and most virtuous nation in the history of the world.
Tonight, the whole world is watching America. And I believe at our best, America is a beacon for the globe.
I was born in America.
I know not everyone shares our vision for the future. If we Americans don't come together again, humanity won't survive.
Imagine the unimaginable. What would the world look like if America did not exist?
The United States Declaration of Independence of 1776, compiled by Thomas Jefferson and signed by the Founding Fathers, that separated the territory of the 13 colonies from the British Crown of King George III, was the foundation laid for the development of the newly formed United States of America. Today, patriotic Americans are enraged that their heroes' statues are being pulled down by the left, but they are only continuing the legacy of their own forefathers, who also pulled down the statue of the British monarch King George III in New York, not long after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. There's absolutely no difference. The American Revolutionary War of Independence that finally surrendered Britain's redcoats at Yorktown was won by the assistance of the little-known James Armistead, an enslaved African-American who served the Continental Army as a double agent that aided the American cause during the Yorktown Campaign of 1781 by acting as a spy, posing as a runaway slave, and gathering secret strategies from British officers and commanders that proved vitally useful for the Continental forces, and also by the assistance of France. You see, Benjamin Franklin was a renowned Francophone making regular visits to France, whose son was blessed by Voltaire. And the French assisted the Founding Fathers to defeat the British to officially form a new nation, the United States of America, the Second Kingdom in Revelation chapter 13. During the French Revolution, the French paraded a statue of a woman who was titled the Supreme Being. In France, a statement that secularism will replace religion. Then the French gave her as a gift to her allies, and she now stands as a symbol of France's alliance with the Founding Fathers in New York, the Statue of Liberty. Though America is described as a democratic republic, many think that presidents are not actually elected but selected, and there are influential globalists at conferences in both the Vatican and in the Billionaires Club at the World Economic Forum in January 2018 who can forewarn you who has to be removed if they find them a major stumbling block that is slowing down the program of the wider global world order plans, the Great Reset.
The U.S. is a problem. It became a far more significant problem with Donald Trump. He may or may not be president after November.
Clearly, I consider the Trump administration a danger to the world, but I regard it as a purely temporary phenomenon that will disappear in 2020 or even sooner.
Now, we can spend hours going on and on about the new administration and how its new commander-in-chief is only continuing the work of previous administrations, but that is a waste of time, for the prophecy clearly identifies a system, not an individual. That's a distraction. So let us carefully look at the prophetic text. Revelation chapter 13 and verse 10 talks of the first kingdom, the papacy, that is symbolically described as a beast that goes into captivity by France. Then in the latter part of the 18th century, roughly around the same time, another beast rises in a different geographical territory, also assisted by France. And listen to the language very carefully and the key word highlighted in red in Revelation chapter 13 verses 11 and 12. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon, and he exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and caused the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, which is the papacy, whose deadly wound was healed. As you can see, there is a consistency in the language, and since those 13 colonies separated from the British Crown, it has embarked on a very brutal territorial expansion program, wiping out not only thousands of innocent lives of the indigenous population of the land that she colonized, but millions outside of her territory also, and her track record is absolutely horrific. She cleverly covers up her multitude of sins with the vehicle she uses to market her American foreign policy to the world, mapped out in detail in her different forms of edutainment via the film and the gaming industry, and she is the perfect candidate to fulfill the prophecy that will eventually by force reintroduce the Inquisition. The rendition program in post 9/11 exposed how nearly all the nation states around the world work with the USA as an ally via the CIA to kidnap innocent individuals and then put them into black sites, prisons and torture camps all over the world, a model of things to come. And Revelation chapter 13 and verse 15 forewarns us that she is going to impose a global death decree on whoever does not follow a specific form of worship. But the following two verses, 16 and 17, details how she will use a global economic weapon on the entire world that will spare neither age, gender, or social status, who does not have either the mark of the beast, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. We may identify what those three things are in another study.
Sarah, Amazon has added retired 4-star General Keith Alexander to its board of directors. General Alexander also served as director of the NSA from 2005 to 2014. He currently serves as co-CEO of IronNet. That is a cybersecurity tech company that he founded in 2014. Now, this is an interesting move, guys, adding someone to the Amazon board with close ties to the government.
So the biggest company in tech, Amazon, is even more closely aligning itself with the US government and increasing its global influence to have a deeper knowledge of people's spending habits. Little known companies like MITRE are keeping a track of the world through its $2 billion research hub of collecting data on civilians in the digital space. But the US government are also conducting a surveillance operation on religious communities. The app Muslim Pro that alerts Muslims to pray wherever they are in the world, According to Vice, the US Military Special Operations Command has been given secret access to that app where they can monitor both the exact time and the geographical location data of where the 100 million Muslim users are praying all over the world. Their excuse is they are trying to trace extremist terror cells. This is very serious, a shadow of things to come. And in Canada, they are conducting a PSYOPs operation to carefully monitor how civilians panic or how they react in a crisis. It is getting very deep worldwide. Wall Street, known as the financial center of the world, can influence important financial decisions in politics. For they financed and gave Joe Biden $74.4 million and Donald Trump $18.1 million. They clearly helped to decide who won. According to the Financial Times, US banks recently took over the financial world, and with that level of dominance over the financial markets, she is the only power on this earth that can make a global decision where no man cannot buy or cannot sell. And she already does it on a micro level via her Department of the Treasury, where according to its official website it can freeze the economic assets of foreign countries and regimes, terrorists and international narcotic traffickers who pose a threat to the US economic interests. If you want to see a trial run of this, you'll have to see how the lockdown and preparing a vaccine is being used to exploit the vulnerable. Though a public health group has or is suing the US's National Institute of Health for documents on the origins of SARS-CoV-2, though a major study has shown that the lockdown stay-at-home orders does not stop the spread of the coronavirus, though health experts that includes 12,000 scientists and medics worldwide have signed an anti-lockdown petition, though one of the most respectable journals, Lancet, says lockdowns only increases poverty, the Pope condemns anti-lockdown protesters who are clearly rioting in protest of the restrictions that are increasing their poverty, and governments are deliberately ignoring the scientists. In different parts of the world, particularly the United States and Australia, they are threatening people that if they do not take the coronavirus vaccine, they will not get no welfare payments and they will not be able to travel overseas. That's wicked. And schools and employers could ban people who do not take the vaccine. A trial run for no man might buy or sell. Or as they have labeled it, this is all just a fire drill or a training exercise according to the US government. But as this study comes to a close, we will observe one of the final tests that the United States is going to perform that will be very deeply supernatural in nature and will challenge the very fibers of your reality. And the narrator wants to make it very clear that only those who are truly and deeply connected to God through constant prayer and study will be able to resist it. The narrator will provide some of the biblical tools to forewarn you of what's to come. I know it's very, very difficult when you lose a loved one, but when they are dead, they are dead. And if you see something that looks like the very person you just buried in the ground, it is a devil. Job chapter 7 verses 9 and 10 says, "As the cloud is consumed and vanisheth away, so he that goeth down to the grave shall come up no more. He shall return no more to his house, neither shall his place know him any more." Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verses 5 and 6 says, "For the living know for sure that they shall die." So we all know we have to face death one day. But the dead know not anything, neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love and their hatred and their envy is now perished. Neither have they any more a portion forever in anything that is done under the sun. In 2 Kings chapter 6 and verse 17, we are given a glimpse of spiritual warfare, that it is God who fights on our behalf for his people. And those chariots of fire, according to Psalms chapter 68 and verse 17, are angels. And in this warfare, God definitely has your back. Just before Jesus was crucified, he gave a very serious warning. Not once about deception, not twice about deception, not 3 times about deception, but in Matthew chapter 24, 4 times. Because though he described his second coming as like lightning, Jesus still knew that many false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders and will mesmerize many people by them. But in Revelation chapter 19 and verse 20, a false prophet is mentioned who will perform miracles to mesmerize people in worshipping the first beast, the Papacy. And in Revelation chapter 13 verses 13 and 14, when we compare spiritual things with spiritual, this is the exact function of the second beast or kingdom, the United States, who is going to perform a very powerful, enticing supernatural act that is going to deceive the majority of the inhabitants of the earth. How will she do this? In 2002, the narrator purchased a book titled Harp by Jerry Smith that documented what the US plans to do with holographic imagery. The Washington Post on Monday, February the 1st, 1999 documented that the US planned to use holographic imagery of Allah in Iraq in warfare. But in another document titled Non-Lethal Weapons, Terms and References by Robert J. Bunker, at the bottom you can see it is a document by the US Air Force, and it goes into more detail. In the section titled Holograms, under Death, it reads that a hologram can be used to scare a target individual to death. Example, a drug lord with a weak heart sees the ghost of his dead rival appearing at his bedside and dies of fright. The hologram of a prophet is the projection of the image of an ancient god over an enemy capital whose public communications have been seized and used against it in a massive psychological operation, and imitating the angels in the days of Elisha will be the projection of soldier forces images which make an opponent think more allied forces exist than actually do. Make an opponent believe that allied forces are located in a region where none actually exists, and or provide false targets for his weapons to fire upon. How is the world being trained for that final showdown? Many blacks that are disillusioned with God through a misrepresentation of his character that includes organizations like Black Lives Matter, who are running back to their ancient pagan roots and think that they're being enlightened, and also many whites who are also disillusioned with organized religion and rejecting the gospel, are also going back to their nature religion of Wicca. They are not aware that they are all being set up for the final deception. And through the influx of shows on both HBO and Netflix, they are slowly desensitizing you and conditioning your minds so that you get so used to seeing occult imagery that becomes normalized, and you will no longer have the strength to stand up to it and condemn things you once viewed as abhorrent. So by the time any occult apparitions take place, you are already hooked, brainwashed, and set up to embrace it. But amidst this global pandemonium, there will be a people who will be able to resist this last great deception and stand firm and will not bend or waver. They will not be following the crowd. They will not be controlled by a denominational creed, but by the word of God. And Revelation chapter 14 and verse 12 says, "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." And we know that according to Romans chapter 5 and verse 3, their patience came through tribulation. For when your foundation is deeply rooted in Christ, Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 6 and verse 48, nothing can shake you. So just as Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees by faith, looking for a new heaven and a new earth, let us follow in his footsteps and claim that free gift that has been promised to us. So I hope the book of Revelation is a lot more clearer to understand. And I know you have many questions. This study was designed to provoke thought. And one of the real aims of creating Even at Doors was to teach people how to research and investigate for themselves. And it is very encouraging when the odd time an individual will contact me and said they are researching what is presented in these studies. We are in a lockdown at the moment, and there are many people who are struggling financially, emotionally, and spiritually. So Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 16 says, "But to do good which is to do good to people and to communicate. Forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. So I encourage you, please encourage people at this time who are going through a lot of loneliness. And I have one more study to do on Ur and the Chaldees, so please stay tuned if life is spared.